In this session, we're looking specifically at relationships between Christianity and Islam in predominantly the Middle Ages. In many respects, this will cover some time period that we have seen in sessions before this, as well as sessions after this. But I wanted to kind of put all of this material together so we can get a protracted look at just the interactions between these two religions and the people of these two religions. So, you know, kind of course, have in your mind some of the things we've talked about before regarding the Middle Ages and what else is going on. Because there's a lot of things going on in the East and West with, you know, rising and falling and dividing and uniting and all sorts of things, and Northern Europeans roaming about, etc. But in the Arabian Peninsula, something different was taking place. And to look at that, I think it's a very important aspect of what we're attempting to do in this course, and thinking about the way Christians have engaged in missions, some of the challenges they've faced in missions, and Islam is one, especially one religion, where there have been a lot of challenges in missionary endeavors and in interactions even to today. And so a lot of what we're going to look at over the next session I think reflects some of that. So let's start by thinking about the Arabian Peninsula in the 6th century AD, a period before Islam had arisen. This period is referred to by Muslims as Jahiliyyah. You know, this is suggesting the idea that there was something distinct about this period that is undone or redone in the development of Islam. The setup of Arabia was largely around tribes. There wasn't a strong unity in the Arabian Peninsula in the 6th century. That a lot of it is related to how the different tribes were related to each other. So, if your tribe, you know, who your friends are, who your enemies are, the alliances you have, etc., all that is built on the tribe that you're a part of. So, you know, you live in a family, an extended family. Those extended families are grouped into clans. Those clans are grouped into tribes. Arabia had a mixed bag religiously prior to Islam. A lot of the people that lived there were polytheistic, believed in a multitude of gods, but there were those that claimed monotheism. Certainly we would think of Christians and Jews being a part of that, but there were also another group of people known as Hanifs. The term Hanif translates to something like pious ones. These were people that also believed in ethical monotheism, the idea that there was one God who expected people to behave in certain ways. But they are not Christians or Jews, so they believe in one God, but is not the Jew or the Jewish or the Christian explanations of God. Furthermore, it's important to see that even though there's this lack of strong unity, there is this diversity, Arabia was not a place that was out of contact with the rest of the world around it. Sometimes people who have tried to denigrate Islam have tried to claim that it was some sort of backwater in the empire, that it was out of touch, all these other kind of things along those lines. But Arabia was a place that had a lot of merchant activity, and so Arabs came into contact with people from a variety of backgrounds. They were aware of the non-Arab world, which meant that they were open to cultural, political, and religious influences. And really, a lot of this at this time period had to do with the conflict that was taking place with the Byzantine Empire and the Persian Empire. Because of that conflict, the Silk Route from Europe to China went through the Arabian Sea, went through India, in order for merchants to trade between these two places because of this conflict. So there's a lot of people traveling through here. One of the key concepts within Arabia at this time is the importance of kinship. And kinship was really, it was about your tribe, your family identity, and really individual rights were subsumed to tribal identity, tribal unity, and a lot of that regulated not just who you thought about yourself, but it regulated justice, it regulated loyalty, and all of the other kind of things that would be attached to how you would think about yourself as being part of a larger group. One of the key places in Arabia was the city of Mecca. Of course, very important today for Saudi Arabia, but at the time also a very important place. It was a pilgrimage site. A lot of the Arabs in the area would travel to Mecca, and there would be people of all sorts of different religions that would travel there. One key place in the city of Mecca was the Kaaba. The Kaaba is a large cube. It's now covered in black cloth that is repaired every so often. It still stands today in Saudi Arabia. But the Kaaba was this large place that was essentially a storage unit for images of, it's estimated to be 360 different deities. And so the idea was that as part of trade or part of merchant activity or whatever, migration that would bring you to Mecca, you would go to the Kaaba, you would pay a certain amount of money, and then the images of your deities would be brought out before you to do them reverence. Connected with that is the importance of the Quraysh tribe. The Quraysh tribe was the tribe that was in charge of Mecca and the Kaaba. And so they were the ones that gained power and gained prosperity from the Kaaba and from this pilgrimage experience that a lot of people engaged in. So that kind of sets the stage a little bit for the development of Islam. And when we think about Islam, of course, and thinking about the origins, we can't overlook or can't overstate, I should say, the importance of Muhammad's life. Muhammad, the son of Abdullah. Muhammad was born in the year 570 AD to a relatively prominent family in the city of Mecca. His family were members of the Quraysh tribe, which we just talked about. But early in life, Muhammad was orphaned. His father died when his mother was 2 months pregnant, so Muhammad never met his father. And this, of course, put Muhammad and his family in a difficult position because he was fatherless. And in a society that values manliness, to not have a father kind of made Muhammad an outcast. Then his mother died when Muhammad was about the age of 6. So very early on in his childhood, he is orphaned. Now, in Islamic tradition, there are a variety of claims about supernatural activities around Muhammad's early life. Claims that, for example, he received the name Muhammad from, or his mother gave him the name Muhammad because of a vision that she had, a vision that also said he would be the leader of his people. There is another occurrence supposed occurrence when he is at the age of 4, when two men are approaching Muhammad, they split open his chest and pull out a black clot. And this would later be interpreted that evil had been removed from his heart. So these probably, are things that would be later additions to try and suggest that Muhammad was special even from his birth, despite him being in a situation where in Arabian society he would have been looked down upon, he would have been ostracized. And so these might have been later additions, even though these additions probably were done after Arabia was Islamic. They are still probably meant to instantiate Muhammad as a figure in the vestiges of this societal notion of fatherliness, manliness. That there's still this holding on to that idea that the Muslim community after Muhammad has to address. After the death of his mother, Muhammad would live with his grandfather for about 2 years, and then with his uncle. Abdul Muttalib is the name of Muhammad's grandfather. So after those 2 years, when his grandfather passed away, he was raised by his uncle, Abu Talib. His uncle would act as his protector throughout his adult life. He too had some prominence. For the early part of his life, because of his family situation, Muhammad would earn his living as a shepherd, working on the outskirts of Mecca. Again, kind of a marginalized profession in the Middle East at times. He would later leave shepherding to work as a trader, work as a merchant. And he became very successful as a trader and eventually started working for a widow named Khadijah. He would later go on to marry her after she proposed to him. Muhammad was about 25 when this took place. It's unclear how old Khadijah was. Some traditions say, she had been widowed twice, which may suggest that she was many years older than Muhammad, but others put her age in the late 20s. So, how old she was is a matter of speculation. But they would go on to have 6 children. One aspect of the success was his reputation as an honest and fair business person. He was nicknamed the Trustworthy One for his character as a merchant. Again, this is a lot of these things are coming from later biographies of Muhammad, but there's no reason to necessarily doubt that he wasn't a man of good character. That does problematize some of the events that we'll talk about here in just a minute. It makes it difficult to understand where this is all coming from. But, to try and impugn his character or to suggest he was evil or that he was a vile person, as Christian writers of the time did, and some Christian writers today will do, that really doesn't help. It's not probably respectful of the historical record, nor is it necessarily useful to try and demean Muhammad. That doesn't work. And to say those kind of things isn't going to encourage someone to listen to you if you're trying to engage in a situation where you're trying to evangelize. Well, so this is Muhammad's adult life. At the age of 40, however, things begin to change. Muhammad would often go on mountain retreats and just kind of separate himself from society, go out, meditate, etc. And on a night known as, he would go to a place called Mount Hira, and on a night in the month of Ramadan. I believe it was Ramadan, the night between Ramadan 23 and 24, but I could be wrong about that. But the night is remembered as the night of power and excellence. And so Muhammad is out on this mountain retreat when, again, supposedly the angel Gabriel appears to him. Yes, the Gabriel that we know of from the Old and New Testaments. And Gabriel supposedly says, read, or recite, and there's a translation difference there, in the name of your Lord who created. He created man from a clot. Read by your most generous Lord who taught by the pen. He taught man what he did not know. So this is kind of believed to be Gabriel calling Muhammad to a special responsibility. And that he is going to particularly be a prophet or the messenger of God, as he's sometimes referred to as well, the Rasul Allah. And so there's the idea here that this is what Gabriel is doing. And so he is called upon, supposedly, to begin preaching particularly the oneness of God against the polytheism of Mecca, and to preach the supposed message that both Moses and Jesus preached, that somehow this is being renewed or restored through Muhammad. So Muhammad started preaching, and for 12 years he preached in Mecca. Very little response. A lot of the people that are becoming Muslims, the term Muslim is one who submits. Islam is submission, so this is someone who is submitting to God. Most of the people that are becoming Muslims are members of his family, close associates, friends. There's not a huge number of people that are kind of adopting this view that Muhammad is teaching. Particularly the Quraysh tribe, of course, is very concerned because if people adopt Muhammad's monotheism, there goes their power and prestige and their money. The early community faced rejection and isolation. They faced physical violence. Now, Muhammad largely was protected because of his uncle and Khadijah for a time because of her role, her prestigious role. Because of the persecution others faced, though, Muhammad suggested that some of the community go to the neighboring country of Abyssinia. Abyssinia was a Christian country, and Muhammad there in the year 615 thought that they would be protected there, that Christians would be more likely to protect this group than what they were experiencing in Mecca. Well, in a short time, Muhammad's protection falls away. Khadijah dies in 619. They've been married for 25 years, and shortly after that, his uncle Abu Talib, who had never converted to Islam. Khadijah did, other people that were associated with Muhammad did. Abu Talib did not, but still supported his nephew, still protected his nephew. But he died shortly after Khadijah, and so Muhammad's protection is gone. So now he too begins to face persecution. Well, Muhammad tries a couple of different things, trying to find protection from the persecution, try to, associate with some nearby tribes, but none of them really want to take this small Muslim community in. The revelations from God supposedly keep coming during this time, and also some very important experiences. Particularly the Al-Isra and Mi'raj, the night journey and ascension. Another very important event in the life of Muhammad and in the story of Islam. So one night, Muhammad is praying at the Kaaba, and he falls asleep. He is shaken awake and looks to see it is Gabriel who is shaking. And he is going to, Gabriel will lead Muhammad to a white-winged animal, supposedly a cross between a mule and a donkey. The animal is called Al-Buraq, and this animal is going to fly Muhammad to the city of Jerusalem. And he sits him down on what used to be the Temple Mount. Remember, this is in the 600s, so the Jerusalem Temple has been gone for over 500 years. But it does suggest that Jerusalem is very important in early Islam. Now, of course, it's still important today, not in the same kind of way as it was, but the mosque, the Dome of the Rock, sits on the Second Temple Mount. And the rock that is inside the Dome of the Rock is believed to be, or is claimed to be, the place that Al-Buraq sets Muhammad down on, and from which Muhammad ascends into heaven. And so from the Temple Mount, he ascends into paradise, which is more often the word that is used within Islam, or the English word used by Muslims, but heaven is the idea. As he ascends, he encounters various prophets. Most of them Jews and Christians would have been familiar with, people like Abraham and Moses and others. The pinnacle of all of this is Muhammad's encounter with God. And during this trip, Muhammad is given a variety of regulations and guidelines for the Muslim community, including that Muslims were to pray 5 times a day, the commandment to not make distinctions between messengers of God, which is a way that Jews and Christians could be theoretically united with Islam because of the respect of Muslims for Jewish and Christian prophets. So this idea of they are Muslim prophets as well. In addition, Muhammad is offered in heaven a drink of either milk or wine. Because he chooses milk, which is then commended, Muslims were prohibited from drinking alcohol. Right? So that's kind of the tradition of why Muslims are not supposed to drink alcohol. A lot of Muslims today drink alcohol, of course, because just like with any religion, there are a lot of people that are just part of that religion culturally, or are not fully committed to all the views or practices. In addition, in this trip, Muhammad doesn't just go up, he also goes down, visits hell. And the purpose of this trip is so that he could then express to those who refuse the message of God what would happen to them. So, by experiencing both, he can talk about the joys of paradise as well as the punishments of hell. Well, persecution of Muslims continued. There were several attempts to kill Muhammad. And eventually Muhammad decides, and some of the other Muslims decide, the time is now to get out of Mecca before we are killed. And so Muhammad gets word of an intent to murder him, and he prepares to escape. He escapes with a close companion of his named Abu Bakr. The two of them escape, and Muhammad's cousin Ali kind of stays in Muhammad's bed, pretends to be Muhammad asleep, in order to allow them to escape. He fled to the city of Yathrib. It is about 250 miles north of Mecca. There had been some interactions between Muhammad and the citizens of Yathrib. Some had visited Muhammad, had converted to Islam, and were spreading the message in Yathrib and gathering numbers of conversions. The city would later be renamed Medina. So you'll see Medina and Mecca on the Saudi Arabian map today, two very important cities. This event, this immigration, known as the Hijra, starts the Islamic calendar. Dates are reckoned as AH in the year of the Hijra. It's in the 1430s. I can't remember the exact year. It is also in Medina where there are significant numbers of converts. Obviously, people had converted before, but now in Medina, there is a significant conversion, many in the city. And so here is often placed the beginning of the Ummah, the Muslim community. And because it is converting to Islam, people are looking to Muhammad not only as a religious leader, but a political leader as well. One of the examples of this political influence is the covenant that Muhammad drew up for the city of Medina. And it is a kind of a contract for the citizens. Some of it is focused on the importance of each of the citizens mutually assisting the others. And really, you know, there were a lot of Jews in Medina, so this is a way for there to be cooperation between Muslims and Jews without requiring the Jews to convert to Islam. So in these early years, some of the relationships between Jews and Muslims are better than what we see a lot today. You know, but some of that has to do with the failure of the Covenant of Medina. The main focus of the covenant was on issues of justice and equality, that the Jews and the Muslims of Medina would not make separate alliances with other peoples, that they would work together for alliances, and that the two of these groups, both monotheistic, would stand against the polytheism in Arabia. But not all the Jews in Medina followed the covenant, and often broke the alliance with the Muslim population. And then, you know, Muslims didn't always act the best way either. And, you know, there's a tension that develops in Medina, and out of that, you see the beginnings of the conflict and the sometimes hatred that you see between Jews and Muslims, especially in the Middle East today. From 622 to the year 630, Medina and Mecca were engaged in several battles. Sometimes the Muslims of Medina won. Of course, that was interpreted as being an example of God's favor. Sometimes they lost, and frequently that was interpreted as it was the fault of the Jews who had revoked the covenant. During this time as well, Muhammad continued to have revelations. The Quran, the Holy Book of Islam, is not ordered chronologically. It's supposedly these revelations from God, but it's not ordered according to chronology. It's ordered according to length of the particular revelation. Scholars of the Quran, scholars of Islam, suggest that it's more likely that the longer revelations are the Medinan revelations and the shorter ones are the Meccan revelations, even though there's not you know, a lot within the Quran itself that gives any sort of indication as to historical situation, time period, etc. So they're having to do a lot of contextualizing and examination and other things to try and pinpoint when these things took place, or at least when they might have been taking place, or when Muhammad preached them, let's say. Well, so you got the revelations going on this entire period, the battles going on this time period, but in the year 630, 60 years from the time that Muhammad was born, 20 years from the time that he is called upon as a prophet of God, supposedly, he gathers a large army to go against the city of Mecca. The army, the Medinan army, is so large that the Meccans decide it is better for them to surrender. According to the stories associated with the time, Muhammad supposedly comes into the city prayerfully with the interest of peaceful interactions because of the surrender, offering amnesty to any of the Meccans who would convert to Islam. Others were to leave the city. He's also said that he went to the Kaaba and started destroying the images found in it, except for a depiction of Jesus and a depiction of the Virgin Mary. While Khadijah was alive, she and Muhammad shared a monogamous relationship. After her death, Muhammad married multiple times, and so he engages in polygamy, which was a common practice in the area. Some of his wives included the daughters of his close associates, Abu Bakr and Umar. He also married the widow of his cousin. He also married a Jewish woman named Safiya. So, there's a wide diversity in the wives that Muhammad takes. There was, however, frequent tension between these wives, even though they're all married to Muhammad. There are some cases where it said Muhammad took some child brides. That certainly is possible. A lot of Muslims downplay that and suggest that majority of Muhammad's polygamous relationships, polygamous marriages tend to be examples of Muhammad trying to provide protection for widows and orphans and others who were in a very difficult position, could be, experience oppression, marginalization. So, again, some Christians have tried to present him as a pedophile. Muslims have responded, no, this is an example of Muhammad protecting the weakest. So, take that for what it's worth. Muhammad also had several children through his lifetime with his various wives. Some of them preceded him in death. One of his surviving children was a girl named Fatima, who apparently was his favorite. She was his favorite child. He also lived long enough to see some grandchildren as well. Another close family member was Muhammad's cousin Ali. And in fact, Muhammad arranges the marriage between Fatima and Ali as an expression of the closeness between Ali, who is his cousin, now his son-in-law. And then, of course, we talked about Ali acting as a decoy when Muhammad escaped Medina. There were other close associates of Muhammad. These become known as the companions of the Prophet. They were highly respected because of the time that they spent with Muhammad. Some of the most important ones are the two that we just mentioned, Abu Bakr and Umar, who would later succeed Muhammad as authorities in the Muslim community. In the 10th year of the Hijrah, Muhammad spoke to 144,000 individuals gathered to mark the Hajj pilgrimage, a very important religious ritual in Islam, and would become a very important ritual after that. And he noted to them that he was not sure whether he would meet them again to observe the Hajj. He returns to Medina a few months later. He's speaking with fellow Muslims about the importance of maintaining the practices and submitting to God, and he becomes weak and develops a fever. However, over the next couple of days, he continues speaking when he had the opportunity. Toward the end, he experiences a lot of pain and was unable to leave his bed. He's fading in and out of consciousness. He does manage to visit a mosque one more time. He distributed his belongings to different individuals and encouraged his followers, those that are coming to see him, to take care of the poor. He dies in the month of Rabi al-Awwal in the 11th year of the Hijra, which is about the year 632 CE or AD. Probably sometime around June is what we're looking at. Of course, rumors of his death began to spread. Some followers are not willing to believe it. They think that this is this is not true. That the prophet, the messenger of God, would die. And of course, with any religious movement, when the founder dies, there is that question of what is going to happen now. Will this movement continue? Will it die off? Well, Abu Bakr makes a speech to the community. He announced his death, and everybody's kind of having to come to accept this, and so he's supposed to have said, Muslims, if any of you has worshipped Muhammad, let me tell you that Muhammad has died. But if you worship God, then know that God is living and will never die. And so the idea here is Abu Bakr's trying to suggest, we don't worship Muhammad. We worship God. Yes, Muhammad is important. He's the messenger of God. But we will continue to worship God as God has laid down. His death, of course, though, leaves a large void. Who is going to lead the community now? Who is going to be the successor to the messenger of God? And so in the year 632, there's a power vacuum that develops that needs to be taken care of. From 632 until the 20th century, scholars kind of point to 4 different developments within Islamic power, the Islamic Empire. And these 4 periods represent different developments, changes taking place within Islam, the waxing and waning of Islamic power, and of course, some of that has to do with how the interactions are taking place with Christianity. Now, Muhammad united the Arabian tribes through diplomacy, but also force. Right? Both of them are present. It's not always by the point of the sword, but sometimes was. And, Islam comes to political power much more rapidly than Christianity does. Now, certainly by this time, 630s, there is Christian political power. We can talk about Christendom. But it had taken several hundred years for that to take place, where we're talking, 12 years or so from the time that Muhammad, 20 years, 22 years, from the time that Muhammad first receives his visions to the time that you have what we can call an Islamic empire or caliphate. So many people are faced with the expansion of Islam. This first period is known as the Orthodox Caliphate, or sometimes referred to as the Golden Age. As we look through these different developments of Islamic political power, I'm just going to highlight some things, not talk about everything. So, Muhammad dies in 632. Abu Bakr gets up and says, no, we're going to continue, we're following God, not Muhammad. But there's still this question of who should take the place of Muhammad. Well, a decision is made that maybe this should be a group decision. So the elders of Medina select Abu Bakr as the first caliph, or the first successor. During this time, a lot of the control is in Mecca and Medina. This is largely a centralized place in the Arabian Peninsula. And the 4 individuals who each in turn take over for Muhammad are the close companions of the Prophet. First, Abu Bakr. When he dies, Umar takes over, Uthman after Umar, and then finally Ali, the cousin and son-in-law of Muhammad. Now, most of the community supported the original selection of Abu Bakr, and a minority believed that Ali should have been the successor, that it should have been somebody within the Prophet's family, especially Ali because of how close they were. Ali, of course, was a senior member of the family of the Prophet, his cousin, his son-in-law. He will eventually be chosen as the fourth caliph, but there's a minority group that believes he should have been first. Well, during this time period, the Orthodox Caliphate expands beyond Arabia, moves into places like Syria, Palestine, Lebanon, and Iraq. These are all modern names. Some of these names were not in use at the time. As it moves into places that had originally been controlled by the Byzantines or the Persians, there were people there, even Christians, who welcomed Islamic rule. They often received the same independence that they had before. Most times it was they had to pay a tax, but they could continue to practice their faith and be governed by their own religious leaders, even though the Muslims were now in control. And sometimes there were places that actually preferred the Muslims to the Byzantines because they felt the Byzantines were overly oppressive. So, you know, that has something to do with this. Muslims would then, from Syria, Palestine, Lebanon, Iraq, move on to places, would move across Egypt, conquer Egypt from the Byzantines in 641. They move across North Africa. Often the conversions that took place were not forced in this early stage. Later, there would often be these mass, sometimes forced conversions. Right? So it's both. It's not simply forced conversions. There are people that are choosing to become Muslim. So largely, this is a period of consolidation in Islamdom and Arabia. But when Ali becomes the caliph, civil war breaks out. He's opposed by a group that included Abu Bakr's daughter, who had also been Muhammad's wife, as well as the governor of Syria. So we'll talk more about that here in this. So, you know, the question of succession becomes a challenge for the community. In addition, Ali tries to arbitrate these disagreements, right? So he's got Abu Bakr's daughter, Muhammad's wife, his mother-in-law, essentially, doesn't like Ali. The governor of Syria, a man named Muawiyah, he doesn't like. He's kind of sitting back in all this, waiting for things to open up. But he's kind of got some things going too that are destabilizing Ali. Well, Ali's trying to keep all these people united, and so he makes some concessions that offend some of his own followers, who then believe he's compromised the faith, and so they assassinate him. And so Ali's assassinated. Muawiyah sees this opportunity, so he seizes control and creates a dynastic rule instead of this community rule. Later down the line, there would be other things that would take place. A man named Hussein, who is the son of Ali, his grandson of Muhammad, rebels against Muawiyah and his rule, and he is killed on the 10th day of the month Muharram. This event is remembered in the Islamic practice of Ashura. Essentially, what we're talking about here is the origins, the historical origins of the divisions between Sunnis and Shias. Sunnis are those that believed in community rule, believed in the importance of a communal discussion of Islamic matters. The Shia are followers of Ali. Minority group believe Ali should have succeeded Muhammad, and believe that that God had brought about divinely guided leaders. So it shouldn't be up to the community, that God had appointed these people, given them special powers, and they passed along in the prophet's family line. And so, you know, Ali was the one that had these, not Abu Bakr, not Umar. Ali was the one that had this special guidance from God. So the Umayyad Caliphate, Muawiyah, governor of Syria, comes in, takes control, moves the rule, Islamdom, to Syria, and his line becomes known as the Umayyads. The capital is Damascus in Syria, and moved there after Muawiyah became the fifth caliph, essentially creating a dynasty instead of a caliphate chosen by the community. A good example of one particular caliph during this time is a man named Abdul Malik. He is the individual who creates the Dome of the Rock. He's also one who creates a variety of imperial coins for his realm, so there's a lot of consolidation that he does. And it's kind of the high point of the Umayyad Caliphate before it starts to break apart. Also during the Umayyad Caliphate, you have the fullest expansion of the Islamic Empire, going from Spain the whole way to China. In the 8th century, Muslims are beginning to enter Spain. They're also extending to India on the other side. Conversion throughout Africa is occurring as well. So they're kind of pushing down into Africa. Often a lot of that conversion took place through merchants and travelers and clerics rather than conquest. Conquest was mostly focused on like India and Spain. The spread into Africa is occurring more through just people migrating, people engaging in commerce, those kind of things. Still, largely Arabic enterprise that's taking place, but Islam is gradually diversifying. Power in Spain was centered in Cordoba, and the territories in that region were known as Al-Andalus. In the year 750, there were some Muslims who became concerned about the apparent lack of religiosity among the Umayyad leaders, and so they staged a revolt, which brought about the Abbasids. Before we talk about the Abbasids, this map gives you an idea of the extent of the expansion of Islam at this time. This particular map showing you from Al-Andalus the whole way into India, places in Africa. You also might be able to notice at the upper left-hand corner the city of Tours in the year 732. The Battle of Tours in 732, which we will talk about, kind of it halted the extent of Islamic expansion. Charles Martel, grandfather of Charlemagne, kind of halts that expansion. So after the Umayyads fall, the Abbasids come into power. Many of the remaining individuals of the Umayyad Caliphate would flee to Spain because, we'll talk about later, a lot of Spain was still very supportive of the Umayyads, even though the Abbasids had come into power. So this brings in the Abbasid dynasty, centered in Baghdad, which brought in more Persian elements into Islamic culture, things that were not strictly Arabic now. And so this gradual diversity that's taking place, diversifying that's taking place. Relationships between Islamdom and Christendom were sometimes good, oftentimes difficult. We can think of the Caliphate of Harun al-Rashid, known in the West as Aaron the Wise. He is the Abbasid caliph whose exploits are the subject of the 1001 Nights. 1001 Arabian Nights might also be a name you've heard. It's kind of the high point of the Abbasid Caliphate. There's mostly peace and prosperity in Islamdom at that time. Relationships are pretty good with the Christians in the West, not in the East. And so they're still trying to push into the Byzantine Empire. But relationships with the West are good. Al-Rashid would correspond with Charlemagne. There was a period of technological and economic exchange with Western Christians. And there was developing of some alliances between these two groups as well. Al-Rashid would also establish a hostel in Jerusalem for Christian pilgrims, so allowing Christians to travel freely to Jerusalem as well as then have a place to stay. He also sets up the first hospital and observatory in Baghdad, which would serve as a model for later rulers. So the expansion of Islam has kind of reached its peak, and so for the Abbasids, it's more about consolidating that time period, but also then, we see a lot of diversifying of Islamic culture because of all of these elements that are coming into. Relationships are good with the West. They are not good with the East. It's almost continually antagonistic between the Abbasid Caliphate and the Byzantine Empire. By the end of the 11th century, however, the Abbasid dynasty is starting to break up into little statelets throughout the Islamic Empire, and there were often some civil wars. A small Asiatic tribe known as the Seljuk Turks, who had recently converted to Islam, seek to gain control during this time. They take over the Abbasid Caliphate of Baghdad and begin attempting to expand their territory, including moving in on Byzantine territory, which brings us to another transition. This map here shows you, of course, the expansion that took place under the under the Abbasid Caliphate, this pushing into Africa, as well as where the expansion was taking place in other places. So the Abbasids give way to what eventually known as the Ottomans, or the Ottoman Turks. Eventually, the capital of the Ottoman Empire will be Istanbul. Istanbul was originally Constantinople. And so it's during this time that the city of Constantinople will fall and Muslims will take control over that area. So we're slightly touching on the area we're looking at, but the Ottoman Empire will continue after that. One of the greatest sultans of the Ottoman Empire was a man named Suleiman. He's the 10th sultan, often considered to be the greatest. He extended Ottoman sovereignty into Hungary, Iraq, Moldavia, Yemen, was using navy to expand in Western Mediterranean. There's all sorts of things that he does. Presided over a revival of the arts. It's known as a golden age, and he's known as the second Solomon. Right, so this becomes this high point when there's this synthesis of Christian, Arabic, there's a synthesis of Arabic, Turkish, and Persian civilization that's taking place. This map gives you an idea of the rise and the waxing and waning of the Ottoman Empire, especially as you get into the later part of the 18th century, 19th century. The Ottoman Empire will end in the 20th century due to the Ottomans choosing to side with Germany in World War I. So as a consequence of that side losing, the Ottoman Empire will be broken up, many of them becoming the modern states we know of in the Middle East. Well, what about those Christians in these Muslim-controlled lands? Some of them left as Muslims gained control, some of them stayed. In those early years, Christians would be allowed to continue to practice after paying a tax. But, again, there was opposition to Christians spreading their belief. Some Christian churches continued to exist. The Nestorian Church, many of those churches that spoke Syriac continued to exist for a while. Others died off. It appears the churches in North Africa disappeared very quickly. One of the few that remained was the Coptic Church, which is still in existence and faces a lot of persecution even today in Egypt. In the textbook, Pearson gives several suggestions for why churches in North Africa disappeared. The separation that they faced from, they're separated from the larger church body, the disunity and isolation that came with that, the fact that there might not have been good discipling done, so that those later generations didn't have strong beliefs, a strong grounding, and so they converted to Islam because they were convinced by it, because they didn't have a good, strong belief. And then, of course, there had been problems with the North African churches in the Byzantine Empire prior to Islam, the oppression that existed there. And so some people might have found, Islam appealing from that standpoint as well. One of the major developments, of course, between the Muslims and Christians was the Crusades. And I'm going to introduce some things, and then I'm going to have you watch two videos by a professor from Cornwall, Gordon Cromwell Seminary, who I think does a really great job talking about the Crusades, the impact, why the Crusades happened, some things like that. But I just kind of want to set up some things for the Crusades. That'll finish this video. I'll have you watch the videos from Professor Reeves, and then we'll look at some things specifically related to mission work. So, when we think about the Crusades, it might seem odd in the 21st century to think about where would people get the idea that this was okay with God to do this. Well, there are a couple of things that develop that are important for thinking about this crusading mentality. One of those is the general acceptance of Christians in warfare. Early Christians were not supportive of Christians being part of the army, at least those writings that remained. Eventually there were Christians in the army in the 3rd century, 4th century. But there was a lot of opposition to that. Now, some of it was due not so much to pacifism as it was to the idolatry that was present in the military legions of the Roman Empire. But eventually, those attitudes start changing. Now, Augustine starts developing this idea of a just war. However, even during Augustine's time, just war required penance. You were still guilty of sin by engaging in warfare. And war was to only be done in self-defense. Gradually, though, it becomes this idea about maybe you can engage in warfare for missionary purposes, which it's still sinful because it's warfare, but it's better because you're engaging it for mission reasons, evangelizing reasons, but it's still sinful to kill somebody in war, especially if you're engaging in warfare for secular purposes. So, there's that aspect to it as well. And that gradually even lessens further throughout the Middle Ages. And so the gradual downplaying of the sinfulness of war and violence and murder or killing, that is an important development that makes the Crusades more likely to happen. Additionally, there is the issues of just war. By the time of the Middle Ages, a just war could be called by anyone, pretty much. It had been the right of the empire, but gradually it was moved to where the knights could engage in warfare to protect churches or protect the oppressed. And you know, the knights were supposed to have this code of, you know, giving your life for your lord, your earthly lord. You know, not using the sword for personal gain. You know, not supposed to be focused on saving your own life. You're supposed to die for your homeland. So all these kind of things are developing in this notion of, at times it is appropriate to engage in warfare. Additionally, there was the notion of holy war in Islam that was often very similar to just war theory. And Islam did have some influence in Europe, even before, you know, the end of the Byzantine Empire, etc. So, you know, there's some influence there as well. There also developed the idea of papal warfare, the Pope calling for war. And so eventually this idea develops, and so if the Pope calls for a war, you don't acquire sin by engaging in that because you're doing so at the behest of the leader of the church. A theological development, not so much related to warfare, but related to why the Crusades happened, is the increased desire throughout the later Middle Ages for pilgrimage. It was believed that you experienced religious benefits if you engaged in pilgrimage. But a lot of the places that you would want to go, Jerusalem, Galilee, all those places are under Muslim control at this time. But you have this desire. So, you know, kind of fomenting this desire to free those lands. And additionally, you know, as the First Crusade is called, there's this idea that perhaps by engaging in this crusade, by engaging in this effort, there would be unification between West and East, especially when it came to the church. So these 6 characteristics scholars point to as suggesting why the Crusades happened. Well, some of it is the theological development that has to take place. Some of it has to do with religious practice, and some of it has to do with kind of the hopes and dreams of reuniting Christianity. So we'll close this video here and now move on to the videos from Professor Reeves for him to give an overview of the Crusades, and then we'll talk about some other efforts between Muslims and Christians, and finally talk about some missionary work and to kind of finish out this section of the course.